15. Rebellion. By the time the princes were murdered, Buckingham was considering treason against his sovereign. Margaret Beaufort and Bishop Morton had been working assiduously to enlist Buckingham to her son's cause. At Morton's request, the Countess appointed her steward, Reginald Bray, a cousin of Lady Hastings, and a man described by Morton as sober, secret, and well-witted, to act as her secret emissary to Brecknock, his chief objective being to overcome any scruples Buckingham may have had about breaking his oath of allegiance to the king and convince him that he should support Henry Tudor. Bray was also exerting his powers of persuasion on such lesser nobility and gentry as seemed hostile to Richard III. Buckingham deliberated for the best part of a month before he finally decided to support a rebellion. What prompted his decision was probably confirmation from the king that the princes were dead. The researches of Carol Rawcliffe for her unpublished thesis, Henry, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, Political Background, 1972-73, cited by Pamela Tudor Craig, show that Richard, unsuspecting, wrote on several occasions to Buckingham at Brecknock. It is logical to assume that he may well have sent the Duke a discreetly worded letter indicating that the deed was done. Only this would have made Buckingham so sure that the princes were dead. Moore depicts the Duke saying that Morton, that when he was credibly informed of the death of the two young innocents, "O Lord, how my veins panted, how my body trembled, and my heart inwardly grudged." The chronology may be incorrect, but the sentiment sounds plausible enough, being corroborated by Virgil, who says that Buckingham was mortified when he learned of the murder. There is no doubt that Buckingham passed on what he knew to Morton, Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor, and later the Woodvilles. No one else was in a position to do so. Moreover, the prince's disappearance and the rumors put about by the king only served to confirm his story. But there was one thing Buckingham obviously did not know, and Richard would never have disclosed this in a letter, and that was how the princes had died and how their bodies had been disposed of. Had Buckingham learned these details, he would have certainly have later on communicated them to Henry Tudor, who would have made use of the knowledge when he came to the throne. But Henry did no such thing. He was, it seems, as much in the dark about these details as Buckingham. The Duke sent Bray to communicate his decision to join the rebels, and also the news of the murder of the princes, to Margaret Beaufort, who was just on the point of sending a courier to Brittany. The conspirators now began to plan actively, using Bray and the Countess's young confessor, Christopher Urswick, as go-betweens. Their ultimate objective was the overthrow of Richard III and the establishment of Henry Tudor on the throne of England, which would benefit all concerned except perhaps Buckingham, who could hardly have expected to receive more from Henry than he had from Richard III, which lends weight to the argument that his disaffection from the latter was prompted by revulsion at the murder of the princess. Buckingham may have seen himself as a later-day kingmaker, and his latter attainder states he was involved in treasonable communication with Henry and Jasper Tudor many times before and after the 24th of September, 1483. Both the Countess and Morton could certainly hope for great things from Henry, who would be most anxious to reward those who had helped him gain a crown. The conspirators realized that, on the death of the princes, Elizabeth of York had become de jure Queen of England. It was probably Margaret Beaufort who first saw the advantages of a marriage between Elizabeth and Henry Tudor, the very heir of the House of Lancaster. Such a union would resolve most of the differences and long-standing divisions between the Lancastrian and Yorkist factions, and would also validate the rather tenuous Tudor claim to the throne, as Elizabeth's husband, Henry, would be the rightful king. Virgil says that Margaret Beaufort, being a wise woman after the slaughter of King Edward's children was known, began to hope well of her son's fortune, supposing that the deed would without doubt prove for the profit of the commonweal, if it might chance the blood of Henry the Sixth and King Edward to be mingled by affinity, and so two most pernicious factions should at once be taken away. It appears that the plan was hers from the first, and that she did all in her power to promote it. Virgil claims he plotted the marriage with Elizabeth Woodville before Buckingham lent his support to the conspiracy, but this does not accord with the chronology of events in other accounts, and, moreover, the Queen could only have received confirmation of the death of the princes through Buckingham. It is clear that neither of these plans, the rebellion and the marriage in particular, would have been proposed or implemented had the conspirators been in any doubt that the princes were dead. This is further evidence that they died before the 24th of September, the day recorded by the rolls of Parliament as that on which the rebels launched their enterprise. Urswick was dispatched to Brittany to lay details of the proposed marriage before Henry Tudor, while the Countess went to London to break the news of the princess's death to their mother. For this thankless task she used the services of Dr. Lewis, an experienced physician of grave demeanor, who attended both the Countess and Elizabeth Woodville. The Countess would have looked too conspicuous visiting the sanctuary, but Dr. Lewis could come and go with impunity. Both Virgil and Moore have left accounts of how Elizabeth Woodville reacted to the awful news. Virgil says she fell into a swoon and lay lifeless a good while. After coming to herself, she wept, she cried aloud, and with lamentable shrieks made all the house ring. She struck her breast, tore and cut her hair, and prayed also for her own death, calling by name her most dear children, and condemning herself for a mad woman, for that, being deceived by false promises, she had delivered her younger son out of the sanctuary to be murdered by his enemy. Moore repeats all these details, adding that after long lamentations she kneeled down and cried to God to take vengeance. Both these accounts have the ring of authenticity and convey vividly the bereft mother's agony. Later, or perhaps on another subsequent occasion, Dr. Lewis gently broached the subject of the proposed marriage, saying that although her sons were dead, she could still become the mother of kings if she agreed to the union of her daughter Elizabeth with Henry Tudor. If this went ahead, she said, no doubt the usurper should be shortly deposed and your heir again to her right restored. Above all, the rival factions of York and Lancaster would be united. Uppermost in the queen's mind was the burning desire to take revenge on her son's murderer, and she agreed to the marriage with alacrity, which she would have done had she not been convinced that the princes were dead. Henry Tudor had been her late husband's enemy, and it is hardly likely that she would have supported his claim to the throne if she had not had sufficient proof of her son's deaths. Moreover, the marriage now made good political sense, and she could once more foresee a future in which she was restored, as mother of the Queen Regent, to something approaching her former power and influence. She therefore sent Dr. Lewis back to Margaret Beaufort to tell her that she would do her endeavour to procure all her husband King Edward's friends to take part with Henry her son, so that he might be sworn to take in marriage Elizabeth her daughter. If he agreed to do this, and overthrew the usurper, she would recognize him as king. Thus the Woodvilles joined Buckingham and others of their former enemies in a coalition to bring down Richard III, and plans for the rebellion, coordinated probably by Bishop Morton and communicated by Lewis, Bray, and Urswick, were laid down during the next 2 to 3 weeks. Margaret Beaufort sent her chaplain Richard Fox to Brittany with the news that Elizabeth Woodville had agreed to acknowledge Henry as king if he married her daughter. The time was indeed ripe for rebellion. In the first week or so of September, says Crowland, the people living in the regions of the city of London and several other southern countries embarked upon avenging their grievances against Richard III. The chief causes of their disaffection were Richard's indiscriminate plantation of northerners in the south, and the desire to bring about the restoration of Edward V, who was then still thought by a considerable number of people to be alive. When at last the people began considering vengeance, it was publicly proclaimed that Henry, Duke of Buckingham, had repented for his former conduct, and would be the chief mover in this enterprise against the king. One of the London chronicles states that many knights and gentlemen gathered together to the Duke of Buckingham, which intended to have subdued King Richard, as the said King Richard had put to death the Lord Chamberlain and other gentlemen, and thereupon many gentlemen intended his destruction. The fact that several small but influential groups of conspirators were now uniting under so powerful a magnate as Buckingham posed a serious threat to the king, and the rumors of the murder of the princes, spread initially by Richard with the intention of removing the occasion for rebellion, gave it instead a new impetus. Later that September, says Crowland, a rumor was spread that the sons of King Edward had died a violent death, but it was uncertain how. Crowland makes it clear that this was not the rumor initiated by the king, and implies that Buckingham and his accomplices were responsible for it. This rumor, decimated over a wide area by agents working for Buckingham and Margaret Beaufort, spread fast and soon infiltrated the court itself. Within a short while it was the talk of the courts of Europe. This was what the conspirators wanted, for they meant to heap such opprobrium on Richard III that his people would be ready to rise up and join them when the time came. What was to their advantage was that there was no point in spreading a rumor that the king could so easily have disproved by producing the princes alive. The story was entirely credible, and people believed it. Within weeks of their deaths, it was widely accepted that the princes had been murdered in the Tower on the king's command. This is hardly surprising, since no one had seen the boys since early July at the latest, and the life expectancy of a deposed monarch was notoriously short. Evidence of how strongly the rumors were believed is to be found in the commonplace book of Richard Arnold, a London merchant, for the year 1482 to 83. This year the sons of King Edward were put to silence. Fabian says it was soon the common flame that King Richard had killed his nephews. The common fame, sorry. The late 15th century was a violent age not noted for sentimentality. It was accepted that men often died horribly in battle or on the scaffold. Yet the murder of children provoked appalled shock and indignation. The Tudor chronicler, Hal, spoke for the majority when he wrote, "To murder a man is most odious, to kill a woman is in a manner unnatural, but to slay and destroy innocent babes and young infants the whole world abhorreth, and the blood from the earth cries for vengeance to Almighty God. Alas, whom will he save when he slayeth the poor lambs committed to him in trust?" Virgil says that when the fame of this notable foul fact was dispersed through the realm, so great grief struck literally to the heart of all men, that the same, subduing all fear, wept everywhere, and when they could weep no more, they cried out, "Is there truly any man who would not have abhorred so foul a murder?" Mancini also, it will be remembered, had referred to men weeping, and that was back in July, when the princes were still alive, but people had begun to fear for their safety. Richard, it was now felt, had committed an atrocious crime, and should pay for it. The fact that people believed so implicitly in Richard's guilt was of greater significance historically than whether or not he had actually committed the crime. It damaged irrevocably his already tarnished reputation, and it cost him the brief popularity fueled by the progress. It also lost him much support among the Yorkist old guard who had served Edward IV, and it prompted many more people to join those who were already conspiring against him. Alive, the princes had represented a potential threat to Richard's security. Dead, they were a very real danger. This public belief in the death of the princes had an immediate effect. There had been some conspirators, mainly in the south, who maintained the belief that Edward V still lived in the Tower, and whose chief motive in rebelling was his restoration. But now, faced with compelling rumors, which were doubtless confirmed by links with Buckingham and Margaret Beaufort, these men also switched their allegiance to Henry Tudor, and coordinated their plans with those of the other plotters, so that the planned rebellion became one cohesive movement to overthrow Richard III and establish a Tudor dynasty. This amounted in effect to a fresh outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. This time, however, the House of York would be opposing that of Tudor in a conflict which, in the final analysis, was the direct result of Richard III's murder of the princes. Margaret Beaufort was now sending frequent messages and letters to her son in Brittany, urging him to come to Wales and join Buckingham in this righteous war against the usurper. Legally, as her attainder later stated, she was a traitor, imagining the destruction of the king and assisting Henry Duke of Buckingham in treason. The Countess, of course, would not have viewed her activities in the light. The triumph of her son might be only weeks away, and she would not contemplate failure, since she must have known that it would herald the ruin of all other conspirators. After his successful visit to York, Richard III travelled on the 20th of September to Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. Queen Anne had left for Middleham with the Prince of Wales and Warwick. By the 24th of September, the rebel plans were complete and coordinated uprisings were scheduled to take place according to the rules of Parliament on the 18th of October. There were to be 5 separate uprisings in Kent. The Houghties, close kin to the Woodvilles, were to march from the moat near Maidstone and Itham moat. Exeter was to be roused by Dorset, Sir Thomas St. Leger, the husband of Richard III's sister Anne, and members of the Lancastrian Courtenay family, Earls of Devon. Lionel Woodville was to organize a rising in Salisbury. Buckingham would have an army standing at battle alert in Wales. On the 24th of September, Buckingham, on behalf of both the Yorkist and Lancastrian factions, wrote to Henry Tudor, inviting him to invade England on the 18th of October to deliver the realm from tyranny. Virgil says this invitation was conditional upon Henry swearing a solemn oath that once England was his, he would marry Elizabeth of York, and says Croyland, together with her, take possession of the throne. Henry Tudor had until now made no effort to promote his claim to the English crown. He owed this new and unexpected opportunity to do so entirely to the murder of the princes and its effect on Richard III's reputation. He now found himself transformed from a penniless fugitive to king-elect in the eyes of many, and he lost no time in taking advantage of Buckingham's invitation. While the conspirators were busy enlisting support among the gentry in the south of England, Henry and his uncle Jasper Tudor persuaded Duke Francis of Brittany to loan him 10,000 crowns, enough to employ 5,000 mercenaries, and fit out some ships. It appears that some of the royal treasure appropriated by the Woodvilles went to finance the venture. By the 2nd of October, Henry Tudor was ready to invade England. The rebels were aware even now that King Richard would command awesome support. He could still count upon the loyalty of great magnates such as Norfolk and Northumberland, and many northern nobles and gentlemen. However, the rumors concerning the princes were now so widespread and so damning to him that his position had been considerably weakened. By the beginning of October, Richard must have been aware of the malicious rumors put about by his enemies and of their devastating effect upon public opinion. Croyland says he was aware that many of his subjects saw him as the wretched, bloody, and usurping boar, the white boar being his personal emblem. He knew now that the princes posed a greater threat in death than they had in life. An innocent man would have countered this threat by exhibiting the princes alive or making a statement disclaiming all responsibility for the deaths, for which he could have offered a plausible explanation, and he would have produced their bodies for honorable public burial. But Richard kept silent and ignored the rumors. He neither denied them nor made any statement about the fate or whereabouts of the princes, nor accused anyone else of murdering them. His policy on the subject was complete silence, a silence he maintained to the end of his life, a silence that he condemned that has condemned him in the eyes of the most historians, and which probably confirmed his contemporaries' worst suspicion. On the 3rd of October, 1483, Henry Tudor's fleet sailed from Brittany, but a storm drove his ships back and kept them in port. From then on, nothing went as planned for the conspirators. Those in Kent rose prematurely on the 10th of October, their aim being to march on London. Unfortunately for the rebels, Norfolk was in the capital, and hearing of their advance, he speedily raised a force and blocked the Thames crossing at Gravesend, thwarting their plans. The Duke then sent an urgent letter to the King of Lincolnshire, warning him what was afoot, and breaking the news of Buckingham's treachery, which had been disclosed to him by captured rebel leaders, along with details of the planned rebellion. Richard III entered Lincoln on the 11th October, and there, the next day, he received Norfolk's letter. Its contents shocked him deeply. He had not guessed that Buckingham had abandoned him, and the news came as a blow. Croyland says Richard received more information by means of spies, and in a very short time the whole design of this plot became perfectly well known to him, who exerted himself in no drowsy manner, but with the greatest alacrity and vigilance. Thanks to the premature rising in Kent, Richard had time to take effective measures against the rebels. He contrived that, throughout Wales, armed men should be set in readiness around the Duke as soon as ever he had set foot from his home to pounce upon all his property. On the 12th of October, Richard sent to Lord Chancellor Russell in London for the Great Seal, informing him that here is all well and truly determined, for to resist the malice of him that had best cause to be true, the Duke of Buckingham, the most untrue creature living. We assure you there never was false traitor better purveyed for. 3 days later, Buckingham was publicly proclaimed a rebel and a traitor. On the same day, violent gales swept across Wales and the West Country. Buckingham was not yet aware that the king had learned of his treachery. On the 18th of October, the day on which Henry Tudor again sailed from France, the Duke raised his standard and, defying the gales, marched south towards the river Severn, planning to cross it and link up with the conspirators in the southwest, who had also risen as planned on that day. The next day, the king sent proclamations to the south and west, advising the people that 1,000 whatevers would be given as a reward for the capture of Buckingham, and naming Morton, Dorset, and others traitors. Meanwhile, Buckingham's neighbor, Sir Thomas Vaughan, had seized the Duke's stronghold at Brecknock for the king. Further proclamations were issued by Richard from Lancaster on the 23rd October. One typically accused Dorset of immorality and adultery with Shore's wife. At around this time, in Bodmin, Cornwall, it appears that a group of rebels actually proclaimed Henry Tudor king. Certainly, from this time on, he adopted the royal style, signing his letters Hendricus Rex, or H.R. On the 24th October, Richard III left Lancaster with an army and marched south, hoping to intercept Buckingham's forces and prevent them from meeting up with the rebels in the southwest. The gales, however, had accomplished his task for him. 10 days of storms and torrential rain had left the countryside flooded, with houses and bridges swept away. Many people had drowned. Buckingham's men were who were mostly unwilling Welsh conscripts, who bore him several grudges, grew demoralized and resentful, and eventually deserted him. Left alone in the forest of Dean, he took shelter with one of his tenants, Ralph Banastre, who betrayed him. The Duke, says Croyland, was discovered in the cottage of a poor man, and was delivered to the king's men at Salisbury on the 1st November by the sheriff of Shropshire. By then the rebellion had collapsed, many leaders were taken, and the rest fled, either abroad or to sanctuary. In the confusion, Morton had escaped from Brecknock, later making his way secretly to Henry Tudor in Brittany. Buckingham's 5-year-old son Edward was smuggled to safety by his nurse, who shaved his head and dressed him as a girl. On the 2nd of November, 2 of Henry Tudor's ships landed at Plymouth. But when Henry learned of the collapse of the rebellion, he sailed back to Brittany at once, there to meet up with Dorset, the Courtenays, and the considerable number of other refugees from England, including Lionel Woodville, who died soon afterwards. Buckingham was not so lucky. Croyland says that the king came to Salisbury with a very large army. A trial took place, and Buckingham was sentenced to death. He begged an audience of the king before he died, but Richard refused to see him. Many years later, the Duke's son alleged that his father had planned to stab Richard III with a hunting knife. Croyland, as a churchman, was outraged that the king gave the order for the execution to go ahead that same day, a Sunday. Notwithstanding the fact that it was the Lord's day, the Duke suffered capital punishment in the marketplace of the city. Virgil states that the king had several other conspirators executed, even of his own household, but only 6 are known to have perished at Tyburn, as well as St. Leger, Richard's brother-in-law, at Exeter. When Parliament met in 1484, it was passed so many acts of attainder that, says Croyland, we do not read of the like being issued by the triumvirate of Octavius, Anthony, and Lepidus. What immense estates and patrimonies were collected into the king's treasury in consequence of this measure. 100 people, including Henry Tudor and Buckingham, retrospectively were attainted, representing 1/4 of all attainders passed in 50 years. 1/3 were later pardoned by the king. Their offices, however, were distributed amongst at least 100 of his northern adherents, whom he planted in every spot throughout his dominions, to the disgrace and lasting and loudly expressed sorrow of all the people in the south, who daily longed more and more for the hoped-for return of their ancient rulers, rather than the present tyranny of these people. This was one of the chief factors prompting a steady trickle of defectors to join Henry Tudor in Brittany, a trend that would escalate as time went on. Although Richard punished Yorkists formerly loyal to Edward IV, Woodville partisans, and Lancastrian diehards, he made no move against Elizabeth Woodville and her kinsfolk. In fact, he offered clemency to Dorset, Morton, and Richard Woodville. This may, however, have been a trap, and they wisely stayed in Brittany. Margaret Beaufort fared worse. She was attainted, but the rolls of Parliament record that the king of his especial grace, remembering the good and faithful service that Thomas Lord Stanley had done, and intends to do for him, and not daring to offend Stanley, for he now needed all the support he could muster from the peers, for his sake remits the great punishment of attainder on the said countess that she deserves. Instead, her servants were removed from her. She was disabled in law from owning any property. Her estates were declared forfeit, and her husband and she was placed under his jurisdiction. Henceforth, she was known merely as Lady Stanley. These strictures, however, did not prevent Margaret Beaufort from continuing to work in secret against the king by spreading further rumors, nor from embarking on a campaign to convert Stanley to her way of thinking and win his support for her son. Stanley was given Buckingham's former office of Lord High Constable, and remained in favour. However, his wife's persuasions eventually had the desired effect, and brought about his gradual alienation from the king. Richard obviously did not trust him. Indeed, he would shortly have cause to regret his clemency to Lady Stanley. On the 25th of November, 1483, Richard returned in triumph to London. He now appeared invincible, but this was largely an illusion. The rumors about the princes had cost him many supporters, high and low, and he could not rely on the loyalty of those left to him. Buckingham's fall had brought to prominence three great magnates: Norfolk, Stanley, and Northumberland, and the king meant to retain their support, even if he had to buy it. Towards those who had opposed him in the past, he would from now on adopt a policy of conciliation, winning over some with lucrative offices and grants. It was also essential to gain, if not the love, then the approval of the people, and to this end Richard made, in the months ahead, strenuous efforts to present an image of himself as a sovereign worthy of respect, a man of high morals and political integrity, keen to uphold the liberties of church and state, a man whose patronage it would be worth seeking. Richard hoped to establish himself as a popular ruler before his enemies had time to retrench for a further attack on him. Nevertheless, he was actually aware of the insecurity of his position, and conscious of the fact that there were two potential focuses for rebellion: the former queen and her daughters in sanctuary, and Henry Tudor in Brittany. Of the two, Henry Tudor was the more dangerous, for the rebellion had greatly strengthened his position as the Lancastrian pretender to the throne, and his presence in Brittany was acting as a magnet to all those who were dissatisfied with Richard III, a steadily increasing number. Already Henry had established a court in exile, and it seemed certain that one day he would make another bid for the crown, perhaps with the aid of a European power hostile to Richard. This was exactly what Henry Tudor intended: to establish his position clearly in the eyes of his supporters and the world at large on Christmas Day, 1483, as Richard III was keeping the festival of the Nativity with great solemnity and splendor at Westminster. Henry made a solemn vow in Rene's cathedral that as soon as he should be king, he would marry Elizabeth of York. Afterwards, his supporters, many of them prominent Yorkists, swore to be loyal to each other before kneeling to Henry and paying him homage as though he had been already crowned king. They then swore they would one day return to England and overthrow the tyrant Richard. This ceremony was intended to inspire others to join Henry's cause, and to bring over to his side those Yorkists who were loyal to the line of Henry IV, thus united them with the Lancastrian faction. It was a masterful move, but it would not and could not have happened if Henry and his supporters had not by then been certain that the princes in the Tower were in truth dead.